Okay, so I feel that given the nature of the first section of my paper, I should today start with something of a disclaimer. My starting point is with problems that have emerged in the identification of certain portraits which derive, to put it crudely, from someone being wrong on the internet. I can safely say, though, that no one has been trolled online in the course of my research, at least not by myself. And I don't spend as much time as this paper may suggest correcting people online. But more importantly, I want to look at some of the systemic causes of these errors and underline the importance of combining the use of new digital tools and methods with more traditional research methodologies in the humanities. To put it more accurately than someone being wrong on the internet, the problem is the way in which we, in academia, and just as importantly, in a range of other professions and with varying degrees of expertise, the way in which we search for images of particular individuals, in my case, portraits of early modern musicians, and the tools that we use on a day-to-day basis, largely Google, can often produce inaccurate results. The increased online access to digital reproduction of portraits, partially through digitization projects, should have made it considerably easier to identify sitters. Indeed, several well-publicized research projects using digital collections and AI-assisted tools have made bold claims to the extent to which computer science can support or even replace traditional art historical methodologies to identify hitherto anonymous works. But to what extent has the digital turn aided or hindered the identification of portrait sitters? Furthermore, we might also ask what impact such research projects have on the broader public reception and use of portraits. Specifically in the area of musician portraits, I'm thinking here of the wider world of associated individuals and organizations that might have professional interest in such portraits: music publishers, musicians themselves, radio stations, recording labels, music publicists, music societies, not to mention that supposedly endangered species, the classical music audience. I'll start with the social media application formerly known as Twitter. And this is where we move into the realm of someone being wrong on the internet. Here's a tweet from the London Bach Society in 2021. On this day, Bach married his first wife, Maria Barbara, at Dornheim. And we have a photograph of the church and a portrait of whom we must assume is Maria Barbara Bach. Annoying art historian joins the chat. I think that's Maria Barbara of Braganza, Queen of Spain, in a portrait by Van Loo. No, the response is the image is accredited as being Maria Barbara. Now, I think this is what the Americans call a slam dunk. Now, possibly this is a copy, possibly this is a low resolution version of the academia painting that you can see there. We should note that this is a portrait that is in a publicly accessible collection with a good online collection catalogue and accessible images and good metadata. There are no questions about the attribution or the identification of this sitter, Maria Barbara of Braganza. So where did the London Bach Society's error come from? A quick Google search for Maria Barbara Bach brings up the usual sea of web pages, but in the summary and thumbnail panel to the right, we immediately see the image of the Queen. An image search has similar results, and of course this isn't rocket science. We're obtaining here results that are partially reflecting the concordance of Christian names, Maria Barbara Bach and Maria Barbara Braganza, and we also have The Spy Who Loved Me, the actress Barbara Bach in the middle. Interestingly, though, none of the web pages from which these images derive seem to relate in any way to Maria Barbara of Braganza. They all relate to Maria Barbara Bach, which of course reflects our specific search query here. But we can also see portraits of the Queen by Domenica Duprat and by Jean Rank coming up as Mrs. Bach. And this is not just a problem that derives from individuals who share names. a search for Francesca Caccini is dominated by this image of a Renaissance woman. Of course, Google is not explicitly stating that this is a portrait of Francesca Caccini, only that it is an image often associated with the phrase Francesca Caccini. But that's not necessarily how the Google result might be read by some viewers. Most art historians would probably be able to identify the image as 16th century and Venetian, and indeed it is a work by Palma Vecchio today in the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid. Nonetheless, the Google results are often taken uncritically, and Palma's painting is repeatedly presented as an image of a composer who was born 60 or 70 years after Palma Vecchio painted it. This is not a problem restricted to women musicians. Here's Jakob Froberger, mistaken, again based on a Google image result, for his employer, the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand. And here's a booklet from a CD recording of an opera by Pietro Antonio Cesti, with the composer confused for his friend, the painter Salvator Rosa. And finally, even the venerable Gramophone magazine falls for the trap of seeing the composer Dufay in Van Eyck's portrait of an unknown man who is completely unconnected to the world of music, except for an old iconographic reading by Panofsky, which has subsequently been proved completely inaccurate. The case of Francesca Caccini is rather interesting and very prevalent, and its prevalence largely reflects recent interest in and research on early modern women composers. Numerous new CD recordings of Caccini's music use it as a cover image, and I should point out here that in the accompanying booklet to this recording, DHM correctly identify the painting as Palma Vecchio's La Bella, but of course a Google search would bring up the CD cover as being associated with Caccini and thus perhaps viewed as a portrait of the composer. Here we enter into the world of citogenesis, and this isn't something from Star Trek. Citogenesis is a term coined by cartoonist and engineer Randall Munroe to describe a process whereby an erroneous claim on an online platform, such as Wikipedia, is repeated by an apparently expert source, which reinforces the validity of the original erroneous claim and is in turn cited by that platform, further validating the error. In our instance, of the first Mrs. Bach, Google provides the original error by associating the image of Maria Barbara of Braganza with the text Maria Barbara Bach. The association of image with text has long been part of Google's search algorithms, but it's become increasingly sophisticated through machine learning, and these sorts of errors tend to be less common than they once were. An added element to this is the actual historical links, tangential though they are, between the two Maria Barbaras. The Wikimedia Commons page for the JPEG of Van Loo's portrait of Barbara Braganza is linked to the Wikipedia page for the Queen, and this states that she was a pupil of Domenico Scarlatti, and this links to the Wikipedia page for the composer Scarlatti, which in turn mentions that Scarlatti was born in the same year as Johann Sebastian Bach. So through a connection such as this, at some point, Google's search algorithm has made the link between the image of the Queen with the phrase Maria Barbara and the word Bach. The citogenesis moment occurs when, unaware of the error, a viewer in the broad music profession sees the incorrect image on Google, repeats it in their own online space, in this instance, the website of the Oxford Bach Soloists, and thus provides what looks like an authoritative confirmation of Google's erroneous information. I'm not saying that the error here started with the Oxford Bach Soloists, but this is an example of an apparently knowledgeable source repeating the original error, which a less knowledgeable viewer might then take as reliable and thus authenticated. Experts in academia, though, are probably less likely to make these mistakes, at least during the course of their research, rather than casual browsing. Many art historians and musicologists might well ask why Maria Barbara Bach, a singer and wife of a concert master in provincial Weimar, would have herself portrayed wearing a diadem and a lavish set of enormous pearls. Why would a 17th century Florentine composer have herself portrayed as though she were a 16th century Venetian? And why would a German harpsichordist be portrayed wearing a richly lined and bejeweled cloak, holding a sword and a scepter? These observations beg the broader question of exactly how did early modern European musicians present themselves through the medium of portraiture. Today, we're constantly bombarded by images of musicians in various media. I thus want to emphasize that identifiable musician portraits prior to the middle of the 18th century are really quite rare. Conclusive identification of the sitter is the exception rather than the rule. Their survival is often the result of happenstance rather than a reflection of the musician's fame in their day or in ours. And in those that do survive, the musician is rarely depicted as the artistic genius so favored of the romantics of the early 19th century. Instead, they often appear as a conscientious professional or as a courtly servant. Although my own research focuses mainly on Italian portraits, given the framework of this symposium, I thought an example from 18th century France would be appropriate. And in fact, this group portrait by André Buis provides an excellent example of the range of problems one faces when studying early modern representations of musicians. The identity of the individuals in this portrait has been the subject of much debate, and there is no documentary evidence relating to the painting. I don't have time to go into detail here about all 5 figures, but suggestions as to their identity have been very much based on just who are the most likely musicians to fit the bill. The player of the bass viol, for example, is usually identified as Marin Marais, but seemingly only because Marais is the best-known viol player of the period. I want to concentrate on the seated figure on the right, this figure here, and the standing figure next to him. The latter has been variously identified as the composer Jean-Baptiste Lully, long dead by 1710, as one of several members of the flute-playing Ottetaire family, or even as Louis XIV. A close study of the score depicted in the painting reveals them to be representations painted with extraordinary exactitude of trio sonatas by Michel de Labarre. Labarre was a member of the Académie de Musique, the composer of 2 opera ballets, and an instrumentalist in the Grande Écurie, the Royal Wind Ensemble. The painted text reads Trio de Monsieur de Labarre, Sonate en trio pour la flûte traversière, première sonate. The other music book, this one in the front here, reads Livre 3 des sonates en trio pour la flûte traversière, première sonate, the 3rd book of trio sonatas published by Labarre in 1707. On a slight tangent, an anonymous portrait of a flautist appeared at auction in Marseille last year. This is clearly the basis of an etching that survives in the New York Public Library that you can see on the right. The library identifies this as Michel de Labarre, but gives no reason as to why. And as Katrina's paper said yesterday, the metadata associated with the New York Public Library's records is extremely poor. The handwritten inscription on the lower border of the print suggests that it is by Buis, but this might not be particularly valuable as it also identifies the sitter as the harpsichordist Francois Couperin, and this is clearly not Couperin, though a portrait of him by Buis is known through other prints. Nonetheless, there is some similarity between the 2 faces, the prominent lines between the nose and the mouth, the dark arched eyebrows. The Marseille portrait could well be the same person as the standing figure in the London portrait, and thus both are possibly Labarre, but the Marseille portrait and the New York print could well be someone else entirely, and the similarity coincidental. The inclusion, though, of Labarre's music, so emphatically painted, tells us, though, that at least one of the musicians in the London portrait is likely to be Monsieur de Labarre. The most likely candidates are the 2 figures physically interacting with the music, the standing flautist in the center and the seated flautist on the right. The fact that the standing figure is shown holding a flute and turning the pages of music as though to introduce the work to his colleagues might be taken to indicate that he is Labarre. However, the seated figure is also shown with his hand resting on his copy of the score in a faintly proprietorial manner. Indeed, given that his score depicts the Premier Desus, the first flute part, while the other depicts the bass, and given that he is shown holding an expensive ivory flute rather than the boxwood instruments of his companions, a case could be made that he is meant to be read as the flautist par excellence and the author of the music around which the painting is centered, Michel de Labarre. One point which might support such an identification of the ivory flute, one point which might support such an identification is the ivory flute itself, a 3-piece instrument which was developed in France during the second half of the 17th century by members of the Ottetaire family. Indeed, the seated figure is sometimes identified as the most famous member of the family, Jacques Martin Ottetaire, though only on the basis of this ivory flute. An unusual feature of the instrument as depicted by Buis is what appear to be 2 additional off-center holes, one just visible above and to the left of the second hole. So we can see there's a little hole there and another to the right of the 4th hole here. Much scholarly ink was once spilt on the purpose of these holes, and one flute maker even manufactured an instrument with these additional holes to demonstrate that they could assist in the playing of chromatic notes. For our purposes, the deliberate inclusion of such an unusual hybrid instrument could indicate that the individual depicted is, as its owner, was a professional flautist and one closely linked to the latest technological developments of his instrument. However, a 1999 restoration of the painting revealed that the holes were in fact discolored layers of paint from an earlier retouching of the damaged sections of the painting surface. Today, the mysterious holes can no longer be seen, a salient reminder to art historians and musicologists alike that decades of iconographical speculation can be rendered obsolete once a painting is closely examined and treated by expert conservators. The seated figure then may not be a professional musician at all, but rather a wealthy amateur. As well as the expensive ivory flute, he is shown wearing a more elaborate costume than those of his companions. Where their coats are decorated with silver brocade, his is decorated with gold, and the skirt of his waistcoat and the cuffs of his justaucorps are lavishly embellished. Why would an individual musician choose to single himself out in such a way from his fellow musicians in a work of group portraiture through both the higher quality of his clothing and of his musical instrument? Aside from the elaborate dress, the seated figure is also clearly distinguished from his companions by a series of common pictorial devices. Although seated at an angle to the picture plane, he is shown turning to his left to look directly out of the painting and directly engage with the viewer's attention, a direct counterpart to the figure at the rear here. This engagement is emphasized by the careful use of light, which, although it touches upon the faces of all 5 individuals, falls squarely on the seated figure. This figure at the rear acts as a counterbalance. He too looks out at the viewer, but being set further back and partly in shadow, his function is almost structural. The angle of his body draws the eye back into the center of the composition, which is then led along the diagonal line of the turned page and the ivory flute, mirrored by the line of the 3 heads to take us back to the figure of the seated gentleman on the right. It is clear that whoever he is the sitter in the formal sense of the term, the subject, and almost certainly the commissioner and owner of the painting. For me, the most convincing suggestion is that the seated figure is one Monsieur Landaïs, general treasurer of the artillery and the dedicatee of Labarre's 3rd book of trio sonatas, which is shown in the painting. His patronage of Labarre has led to the composition and publication of the music upon which he rests his hand. Composer and patron are united by the musical scores and seated with other musicians who will realize that music in performance. The standing figure at the rear left is almost certainly a self-portrait by Buis. Thus, the collective creators of the music, both as text and as performance, are watched over by the creator of the image which immortalizes them all. My identification of the seated figure as Monsieur Landaïs is only a hypothesis. I've yet to find a portrait of Landaïs with which to compare the painting by Buis. Without that control or other forms of documentary evidence, it remains a hypothesis. Indeed, the identification of the standing figure as Labarre is also a hypothesis, perhaps a convincing one on the basis of the painting's internal evidence, but a hypothesis nonetheless. To return to the subject of Citogenesis, if we have no other portraits of Landaïs, a digital data set of portraits is never going to be able to identify him. And indeed, given the right or wrong Google search, our potential Monsieur Landaïs might be identified as a specific composer. There is no known surviving portrait of Maria Barbara Bach, so Google gives us the next best thing, or the next best guess, Maria Barbara of Braganza. There is no known portrait of Froberger, no surviving painted portrait of Francesca Caccini. Digital datasets must be used in conjunction with traditional documentary and comparative research methods for them to be fully effective as research resources. The desire to put a face to a name is a natural one, but how do we ensure that it's the right face? To invert the title of the opening song from the Labarre's Choix de Chanson, for most early modern musicians, their portrait remains méconnu. Thank you.